Okay. Once again, I'd like to welcome everyone to these Wildlife for You webinars. We give these obviously to teach the general public about wildlife. They're designed for you. So today's webinar is going to be, it's titled Nature's Super Sleepers, but this is the brown bear edition. Many of you have probably seen this webinar before. Well, not this exact webinar, but the Super Sleepers webinar that we've done in the past. In fact, Stephanie Dennis took over for me last time this class was offered, but she focused more on the black bear edition. And so this webinar, you're going to see a lot, so some of the same things, not all the same things, because we're changing animals. We're still talking about bears, but our feature animal in today's webinar is the brown bear. And so that's what is going to be the focus of tonight's webinar. We're going to talk about a lot of different things about brown bears, but mostly how they go through and why they go through that hibernation, why they are nature's super sleepers. So with that, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Daryl Radijak, wildlife biologist and bear specialist. And I'm sure many of you know this already, but I'm going to give it in case someone watches this for the first time, they know who their instructor is. So just to give you a little bit of information about my bear experience, I started my career after I received my degree in wildlife management. I started my career as the manager of the Appalachian Bear Center. That's ABC. East Tennessee, it is now known as the Appalachian Bear Rescue. I was their first manager. This was back in the late 1990s. Did that for almost 5 years. It was awesome. I was working with bears every single day, handling them, releasing them, following them, feeding them, doing all sorts of really cool things. That was awesome. It was a small, tiny nonprofit, so I had to get a real job. And so shortly thereafter, I began working for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. And because of my bear experience, I was soon promoted and I became the bear coordinator for the state of Tennessee. And I did that for about 7 years. So instead of me being over individual animals, I was actually managing bear populations within the state of Tennessee. Once again, they saw something in me and they promoted me again, and I became chief of wildlife for the state of Tennessee. So I was over all wildlife within the state. Because of that role and responsibility, I was working with a lot of southeastern states. In fact, I was on this large carnivore working group for the entire southeast. So we were figuring out how to manage bears over a large regional area. So with that, all that experience, all these years here and there, I got over 20 years working with bears throughout my career. Now, I will tell you, most of my hands-on bear work has been black bears, but I've dealt quite a bit with numerous conferences where we're talking grizzly bear management. In fact, we talk polar bear management every once in a while as well. So I do have quite a bit of experience dealing and working with bears, so hopefully your mind is at ease that you're learning from someone who's been there and done that before. So with that, let's get started with this. And once again, what we're going to do today is we are going to talk about nature's super sleepers. And what we want to do is we want to take a peek into this world of brown bear hibernation. So brown bears, for the most part, many of our webinars focus on black bears, but we're going to be dealing with brown bears. So let's figure out from the front end, what are we talking about? And so when we're talking about brown bears, I want everyone to be on the same page, because a lot of people call these animals different things. And you can picture this in your mind. This is what many people typically envision, and they will call this bear a grizzly bear. And that's fine. You can call it a grizzly bear. There's another animal out there that's in this brown bear family that looks like this animal on the right. That is an Alaskan brown bear. So you have a grizzly bear and you have this Alaskan brown bear. Now let's look at their scientific name. So that grizzly bear, its genus and species is Ursus arctos. That's for a grizzly bear. Guess what this brown bear is? It is also Ursus arctos. They are the exact same species. So that's one thing I want people to understand. When you hear about a grizzly, we're also talking about a brown bear, and I'll explain that. The reason they look so different is because of this term, and I hate this term, but a lot of people say they're different subspecies, and they are, but I think it sometimes gets confusing. But if you look at the grizzly bear, it's Ursus arctos, and the variety or subspecies is horribilis, which is an awesome name. I love that name. Whereas that Alaskan brown bear is Ursus arctos middendorfii. Now, same species, why do they look so drastically different? It's pretty simple. Those bears on the left that we typically call grizzlies, the reason they look like that, they're a little bit smaller, obviously, but it's pretty much because of the food sources. These grizzlies, which many people picture, are the brown bears that live in the interior part of North America, so away from the coast, pretty much Rocky Mountains. And so those bears in Yellowstone and all throughout the Rockies, the Canadian Rockies, those are what we call grizzly bears. And that's what they look like for the most part, that picture on the left. You have to understand, when they're in those mountain ranges, their primary food source, very much like black bear, it's that omnivorous type of diet. So they're eating lots of berries, lots of vegetation, meat every now and then. But for the most part, there's a lot of vegetable matter in there. So they don't grow as big as that bear on the right. Now that bear on the right, he's huge. Think about what he's eating. He's living along the coast. He's not that interior bear. He's living along the coast. And what obviously we have is these tremendous amounts of protein food sources. So you have those salmon runs. There's a lot of other protein food sources, which I'll show you here in a little bit. And so the fact of the matter is those Alaskan brown bears can eat a whole lot more. They have a whole lot more nutritious food that allows them to grow much bigger. So hope everyone understands that this grizzly and this Alaskan brown bear, they're the exact same species. They just grow differently and look a little bit differently because of that food source that they get into. So I'm going to be talking about brown bears, which includes both of these. And so throughout this discussion, I'll show you examples. I'm going to quiz you throughout this to see how well you're paying attention. So let's start by just trying to figure out where these bears are, these brown bears that we're going to be talking about throughout this whole discussion. This is the brown bear range if you were to land in North America before Christopher Columbus. And so you can see that red outline there. That is pretty much the entire western half of North America. And that's where grizzly bears dominate. They're a western bear species. Now, because of us Europeans thinking that we can just go in there and wipe anything out, hopefully we're changing our ways, their range has reduced drastically. And so now if you look at this outline here, you're seeing that their range is much smaller than their historic range. And for the most part, you have all of Alaska, a good bit of that western portion of Canada, but then it dips down into that lower 48 through a couple of states. You have Idaho, a little bit of Washington, Montana, and Wyoming. And so that one that dips down that you see that little finger jutting out, obviously that's where the Yellowstone population of grizzlies are. But once again, as you can see, they're mostly a western species. Now, if you look at these two pictures I have here, obviously the one on the left is that interior, what we would typically call a grizzly, and the one on the right is one of those Alaskan brown bears. Again, same species, just different food sources. So today's webinar, we're going to focus on hibernation and what brown bears do. Very much like the black bear webinar on hibernation. In order to understand what's going on, we have to look at what the bears are doing throughout the entire year, because it truly impacts their hibernation. So to get started here, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the life of a grizzly, or the annual cycle of a grizzly, as it goes through the 4 seasons. And obviously the one that we're going to focus most on towards the end is what they're doing in the wintertime. But in order to figure out how they survive that winter, we got to look season by season to see what's happening. And so to get started here with these brown bears. Let's start with the spring. So we're imagining these grizzlies or these brown bears are just coming out of their den. They're just waking up. And so this den emergence is going to be taking place. Now understand, in the black bear world, there's a lot of variation of when these black bears are coming out of their den, because in those southern latitudes, they might not hibernate too long. Some may not at all, but most bears do, the black bears do. But because of those warmer climates, especially in Florida and Louisiana down south, they may be coming out of their den as early as February, early March, whereas these brown bears, these grizzlies, these animals, because they're that western species, and they're pretty much restricted to a lot of those mountain ranges and those northern latitudes, they're in the den much longer than black bears. So typically they're going to be coming out of their den usually around very late April or early May. A lot will depend on that winter when the snow comes off those mountains. And so den emergence is going to occur. Now they've been in there for a long time. So what are they going to be doing? Obviously, those female brown bears, they're going to be giving birth to those cubs inside those dens. So obviously, rearing of cubs is first and foremost on that female brown bear's mind. And that's what her job is. And I will tell you, without a doubt, Bob Howdeshell, who supplies pretty much all these pictures, fantastic. You look at this Alaskan brown bear, absolutely gorgeous. You see that this mother bear is really attuned to making sure her cubs are eating. That's her primary goal. And again, some of these pictures that we have here are absolutely gorgeous, but her main responsibility throughout that springtime is rearing those cubs. Now, besides rearing those cubs, they have one other responsibility, and that is eating. So you get a big male brown bear like this. His goal is eating. Obviously, in early spring, there's not a ton of nutritious foods out there. They're going to be eating a lot of grasses and whatnot. Now, you have to understand, the time period we're looking at right now is immediately after hibernation. So they've emerged from their den. The mother has this responsibility of feeding herself and her cubs. A lot of these bears have been without food for a long time, so they're famished. You've heard this before. They haven't eaten for 4 to 6 months. They may have lost up to 30% of their body weight, which is quite a bit. You look at a 300-pound bear, it's coming out dropping 100 pounds. That's pretty substantial. And so they're really, really hungry when they come out. That's because they're surviving their hibernation. They're trying to rebuild their bodies. Because of this, because their bodies are stressed, oftentimes, very much like black bears, you get these brown bears that are a little bit grumpy. And so they're prone to some bad behaviors. They're trying to find that nutritious food source to begin building their bodies back up. Sometimes they get in bad situations, very much like black bears. However, you have to understand, brown bears, for the most part, are usually far, far away from people. Now, if they are close to town or any human developments, campgrounds, anything like that, they can get into trouble just like black bears do. So because of this hunger pain that they have after emerging from the den, they sometimes can be more aggressive. Now, I will tell you without a doubt, grizzlies or brown bears here, they are a much different animal than a black bear. A black bear, for the most part, you intimidate that black bear. You don't really do a good job intimidating a brown bear. They're much larger animals. They don't feel as threatened by us. And so this is really the time of the year you've got to pay particular mind to any type of encounter you might have with one of these grizzlies or brown bears, because they are pretty much the king of the land wherever they are. And obviously, you have to understand, remember, those moms, they have that responsibility of feeding themselves, and they want to feed those cubs too. So those moms are really protective, especially when their cubs are so vulnerable at this time. And so remember, their goal right now in the springtime, build that body back up, because that hibernation just took a really big toll on their body. And so they're a little bit grumpy, a little bit crotchety, kind of like me, but they're literally just trying to survive at this point in time. So let's advance to the next season. I'm going to quiz you here because I think this is a cool picture. Once again, primary responsibility of brown bears, or any bear for the most part, is eating. Making sure you are building that body up in preparation for that wintertime hibernation. And so if you look at this picture, who can guess? Would this be more of a grizzly or more of one of those coastal brown bears? Yes, grizzly. Now, keep in mind, this thing is eating. You can see it's eating some of the berries. And that's typically why these grizzlies tend not to grow as large as those coastal bears. But this is, I love this picture because let's look at this picture really quick. And I'm gonna quiz you from some of my other classes if you attended them. There are certain characteristics you can look at to differentiate between a black bear, like a silver phase or even a brown phase black bear versus a grizzly. Now, one of the things that's standing out here, what can you look at in this picture that tells you that is a grizzly as opposed to a black bear that just has that brown color phase? Anything stand out? Excellent, excellent, excellent. Well, the claws, it's not so much the longer claws. They are shaped a little bit differently, but one of the distinguishing factors, and unfortunately you can't see it oftentimes, but one of the distinguishing factors between grizzlies and black bears isn't so much the length and the shape of the claws, it's the color. And so grizzlies or brown bears tend to have white claws as opposed to black bears that tend to have black claws. And I thought this picture was really good because those light-colored, whitish-looking claws really stand out. So you know this bear here is definitely a grizzly as opposed to a brown phase black bear. So, okay, this bear is eating. Summertime, that's his job. He's got to eat. Now, remember, that was an interior grizzly. Those coastal bears, they will still be eating vegetation, any of the berries that's in bloom along the coast, but they also have access to lots of other food sources. Can anyone guess what they're feeding on, what this bear might be feeding on? Seaweed? I don't know if they do. I haven't really seen many bears eating seaweed because usually they're going for more bang for their buck. Crabs. Believe it or not, a lot of them will actually go clamming. They will actually pull clams up, they crunch them, open them up. It's amazing how delicate these bears can be when removing the actual muscle meat from those clams. They'll crack them open, scoop out the inside, and then just move on. And they just go up and down these beaches, literally going clamming. But absolutely, they will eat crabs. They'll eat more of those protein-laden sea creatures as opposed to, for example, the seaweed that Shirley suggested. So, some of them are actually known to eat GoPros. I had to throw this in there because I saw this picture and I just thought it was fantastic. So someone left their GoPro in a spot where one of these brown bears could get at it, and it decided to give it a go. So, all right. Now, understand, we're still in the summertime. Just like black bears do, these brown bears also have their mating season in the summertime, and I'm gonna tell you why this relates so much to hibernation. But as you can guess, this picture here is these coastal brown bears. Really big animals. You could see the male in the back, really square, blocky head, huge behemoths. These things could grow 1,200, sometimes 1,500 pounds, gigundous bears. Mating season rolls around. Obviously, you don't want to mess around with them during that mating season. Now, they're coming into that mating season pretty much the same time all the brown bears are, and so mating season between grizzlies. And again, you see the very different look to these animals. Again, same species, but these are the interior type of brown bears. These are the grizzlies. So obviously, summer rolls around, things are going good, they built their body back up, there's lots of food available out there, they're kind of relaxing, they're feeling good, they get a little Barry White playing in the background. Before you know it, male and female come together. Now, why is this important? As it relates to hibernation, you have to understand that these bears right now, their goal is maintaining that body, build it up to survive that hibernation. Good thing in the summertime, you have those decent food sources out there, lots of relaxing going on. But with this mating season, what's going to happen is the male and female are going to get together. He's going to breed with her, and those eggs are going to get fertilized. But we've talked about this many times. This concept of delayed implantation is so cool when it comes to bears. And so that fertilized egg occurs in the summertime. Not going to implant inside that female's uterus, because as soon as it implants, it starts growing. But they don't want that. Their bodies are designed to figure out when is a good time for those fetuses to start growing. So just want you to understand, in the summertime, all this takes place. Again, this is how it relates to hibernation. So summertime moves along. We get into that fall period. Again, there's one main responsibility for these bears, and that's eating. And so unlike black bears, where the predominant food source for most black bears is going to be that mast crop, that nut or acorn crop, bears, the brown bears, depending on where they're at, they're shifting their diet. They're trying to get more of that bang for their buck. And so the good thing is, at that time of the year, especially along the coast, you get those big salmon runs. And so those bears, begin in late summer, early fall, will literally be feeding nonstop on a lot of those salmon runs. Even bears, interior bears, Yellowstone, sometimes you get those salmon runs in those streams up there. It's obviously not as wealthy or as big of a protein source as compared to what those coastal bears get, but obviously their main goal here is eating. And so what you have here, this is what they're striving for. You have a grizzly or a brown bear come out of hibernation, and it looks terrible. It looks gaunt like that. So pretty skinny, really needs to beef up. So that end goal is for that bear to bulk up. It's got to put on all that weight. And so the end goal is to look like that bear in the bottom picture. And so you have to understand what's going on here in this fall time period is this is just before their hibernation, a month or two before they're going to be going back to bed for a number of months. And so gaining weight is paramount to their existence. The best thing about this, and obviously Mother Nature knows best, she designed things this way. There's awesome food sources available. You have those salmon runs, lots of those. You still have nut crops or acorn crops in a lot of those mountains. Might not be as high portion of the bear's diet as it is with black bears, but there's tremendous amounts of really nutritious, power-packed foods available. And so those bears are pretty much nonstop eating. We'll see. Can anyone remember that technical term for this feeding frenzy? Oh, geez. Surely you got it already. Hyperphagia. It comes from the Greek word. It's literally just a nonstop feeding frenzy. And that's what these bears are doing. So black bears, brown bears alike, they enter this hyperphagia. So they're literally feeding many times 20 hours of the day, bulking up. And so immediately they're consuming these things. Their body is converted into fat reserves. And that's why they're able to bulk up so much. I think I have a bear gene in me because I could bulk up pretty quickly too. So with that, remember that mating that we just described that took place back in early summertime? If it's a female bear, say this bear on the bottom is a female bear, her body is still holding on to those fertilized eggs, and it's looking to say, hey, do we have enough layers of fat on here? Because it needs those layers of fat in order for those cubs to be born. And so their body, obviously this is not a conscious decision of the bears. It's all chemical and these biological processes. but the body is determining whether or not it could support that pregnancy. And so it's checking to see if it has adequate fat layers. If it does, those eggs are going to implant. Now remember, this is the fall. We're talking October, early November. That body is still building up, and if it has those ample layers of fat, those eggs are going to implant, and the female will become pregnant, and those eggs will become fetuses, and they're going to start growing in late fall. So we're talking November, possibly, maybe even early December. It's that long until those eggs begin growing into fetuses. If, however, she is having a really hard time finding food, I don't know what's going on. Maybe she was injured, maybe she was sick, and she kind of looks like this bear in the top picture, and she's really underweight. Her body sends a signal to say, not a good time to get pregnant. Let's abort that. And so those eggs will be reabsorbed into her body, and she's going to enter that den that winter time, and she's not going to give birth. That's why Mother Nature is so absolutely fantastic when it comes to designing these animals and what they do. So you have to understand, spring, summer, fall, past. Everything is pretty much, there's a specific design to get her ready or him ready for the wintertime, because there's one thing that they do in the wintertime, and that's sleep. And so these brown bears, unlike some of these black bears that are in the southern latitudes, these brown bears may be going into den for 4, possibly even 6 months at a time. So winter is not always correct, because sometimes it bleeds into late fall and early spring with some of these brown bears. So before we get into the next half of the discussion, any questions about what these brown bears / grizzlies are doing throughout the year? If you guys are good. Was there any questions? I could scroll up to see if I missed anything, but put it this way, if you asked a question and I missed it, re-ask it again. Dana, the eggs usually reabsorb. Her body just takes them in. They won't implant on the uterus. I don't know the specific way they get reabsorbed. Well, put it this way. I've always been instructed and read that they get reabsorbed. How they know that is a really good question. But regardless, the main point there is those eggs will not latch onto the uterine wall and begin developing. Lori asks a question, is 2 a usual number for a litter? And very much like black bears, a lot of these bears are the same in that young females, first-time mothers, generally give birth to 1 cub. They've never done this before. Their bodies are still growing themselves. And so the first time they get pregnant, now I will tell you, grizzlies tend to sexually mature a little bit older than black bears. A lot of the female black bears will begin giving birth at the age of 3 years old, 4 years old. Some of these grizzlies, the female grizzlies, may not be sexually mature or ready to give birth until they're 5 years old, maybe even 6 years old. So these brown bears don't reproduce as quickly as the black bears do. Now, having said that, when you have a young female brown bear and she's given birth for the first time, typically they give birth to 1 cub. It's kind of, I wish humans could do this. It's kind of a test run to see if you're a good parent. But generally they give birth to 1 cub. Much easier to raise. They kind of learn the ropes of what they've got to do. And then every time after that, it's usually multiple cubs getting born. Having said that, a lot of it depends on the condition of the female's body. Very much like black bears, when she is extremely healthy, and in this case, health is dictated by how fat she is. When she's extremely healthy and can provide milk, provide warmth, provide everything those cubs need, they tend to give birth to more cubs. So she may give birth to 3 cubs. It's rare among grizzlies to go up to 4. fairly, not real common, but black bears have been known to do it. But 2 cubs is typical for adult female grizzlies. Once in a while, she'll give birth to 3, but that, again, is dictated by how healthy she is. Very, very good question, Lori. Okay, Dawn, I did see that question. I'm glad you brought that back up because I forgot it. About the black bears having black claws. I don't know if there's a particular reason why they are black, but the claws on brown bears versus black bears serve a different function. You see in this picture here, again, very good example of those claws being whitish, obviously on this brown bear or this grizzly. They're also very long. Understand that brown bear claws are designed for digging. They are, whether or not they're digging clams, they're digging something out of the ground. They're flipping over rocks. They're designed as a tool to help them feed. And so those claws for those brown bears are designed for digging. Black bears, their claws are designed for climbing. They're very sharp, they're very curved, and so they allow a black bear to climb a tree easily. This is one of the reasons why grizzlies, even the young grizzlies, they're not really good tree climbers. They can get up in some trees, but for the most part, they can't climb trees like black bears because of the shape of their claw. Now, why the coloration? I don't know if there's a good reason for that, but there's definitely a huge difference in design because of that function difference. All right. Let me look at these questions and make sure I get to them before we move on. I'm just expanding my chat box so I can see the whole thing. Okay, Dawn asks, do all bears live in the same genre of places or general places, or do all breeds live in different places? There's a lot of overlap, and so now understand the coastal bears, the ones that are truly on the coast, have that big blocky look. The interior bears, we're talking Yellowstone in those Rockies, Canadian Rockies, they have that grayish grizzled look, a much smaller bear too. Without a doubt, as those 2 kind of distinct subspecies overlap, their species overlap, they can mate with each other. Even a grizzly from Yellowstone can mate with a brown bear and produce viable offspring because that's the definition of a species. It blends. You get these bears that kind of look, when there's that overlap, they kind of look very like a mixed breed. And so I am not a big fan of all this subspeciation because I think it tends to confuse people. But just understand that brown bears from all over the continent, they're the same species. They just have different looks to them. And so they can mate with each other. They can reproduce. They can create more brown bears. And so I hope I answered your question. Okay, Kelly writes, in 2009, I went to the zoo for the last time. Sign there on the grizzly habitat said the bears are called grizzlies because of the grizzled look and the light tips of the hair they have, but not all grizzlies do have lighter tipped hair. Is that true, or just one of those instances of not really true but commonly believed? Yeah, it's kind of true. Those interior brown bears do have that grizzled look, and I believe I'll point it out on a couple more slides coming up. I don't know if that's why they were called grizzlies. It could be. I'm not sure the origin of the nickname grizzly. But one thing I meant to mention earlier, and I could bring it up now. A good way to understand this whole idea of brown bears and grizzlies is that all grizzlies are brown bears, but not all brown bears are grizzlies. And because those brown bears are typically what we're referring to as those coastal bears, so not all of those are grizzlies, but all grizzlies are a type of brown bear because they're literally all brown bears. So hopefully you'll be able to remember that. That's an easy way for me to remember it. Okay, Gail asks a question, how long do the cubs stay with their mother? It's typically very much like the black bears. They will give birth. Those cubs will stay with that mom all throughout that first year. They'll go back into the den with that female, and then when they emerge, in most cases, when those cubs are a year and a half old, those grizzly cubs or those brown bear cubs, they tend to separate and go about their merry business. Now, it has been known and it's been documented where sometimes those cubs may stay with mom almost 2 years, but it's very dangerous because if she comes into heat again and she attracts some of these large males, obviously very much like black bears, these large male adult grizzlies don't take too well to these younger cubs being around. And so for the most part, it's more or less trying to protect your offspring. And so typically they will leave mom after a year and a half, but believe it or not, some have been known, especially if there's not a really high bear density, and some of those have been known to hang around with mom for longer than that. But they got to be very careful if they encounter some of these rogue adult male grizzlies. Lori, I don't know the answer to that question. That would be something I'd love to ask Frank Van Manen. Frank Van Manen, in case you don't know, I used to work with him in Tennessee. He is now the leader of the interagency grizzly bear team out in Yellowstone. So he's got the dream job. But if I talk to Frank, I'm going to ask him your question about whether or not some eggs get absorbed, some implant. If a female is underweight, yeah, I can almost guarantee, there's no studies or anything, but I can almost say that's what happened. Because when she gets fertilized in the summertime, it's usually multiple eggs. And then based on her level of health, her fitness, those layers of fat, her body's going to dictate what she can support. And so there's a really good chance she could have had multiple eggs, but she only gives birth to one cub. And the only lesson there, anything to learn there, is that those other eggs obviously did not implant, were absorbed. Okay, a couple more questions, then I'm going to start the second half. All right, Don asked, earlier I asked a question about whether or not all bears get even angrier when someone tases them or if they have a different reaction. I was actually listening to a podcast this morning. One of my favorite podcasts is Steve Rinella's podcast. And he was interviewing a wildlife officer in Colorado. Now, he wasn't dealing with grizzlies, but this wildlife officer, they use tasers on bears. They use them on moose too, which I thought was crazy. But they use the tasers on bears. Now, for the most part, they're using that as aversive conditioning. And so I don't know if a bear would get angrier. They do not like it. So these tasers are really good tools for aversive conditioning. Nobody in their right mind would want to get tased. And so I definitely don't think it's a level of anger. It's more of a level of fear when they get hit by these tasers. Trish asks a great question. Says, I'm guessing reintroduction of grizzly bears to some of their former range isn't well received by some states. Is it even possible? I'm going to give you an answer you don't like. I would say active reintroduction where a state wildlife agency comes in and releases bears probably ain't going to happen. There's so much controversy. There's so much fear when it comes to predators. And yes, everyone on this webinar probably understands it's probably an unnecessary or unwarranted fear. But because the public is so afraid of lions and tigers and bears, oh my, that active reintroduction where we're bringing animals in probably is not going to happen. Having said that, wildlife agencies are very, very open. In fact, that's what they're trying to do, is let bear ranges expand naturally. Case in point, the state of Washington, they have a couple of grizzlies in the far eastern portion of Washington in the Cascade Mountain Range. They've been there for a long time. There's only a couple. There's only a handful. There was talk about potentially reintroducing bears. It's not going to be active reintroduction. They will gladly let those bears repopulate those areas, even though there's people that don't want them to. I think the State Wildlife Agency is wide open to it. The general public, for the most part, is wide open to it. They love the idea of animals occupying their former ranges. We've done studies that show that people are all in favor of having bears within their state. Then when you say, well, what if they're in your town? And they're like, eh. So their level of excitement goes down. And then when you say, well, what if they're in your backyard? And they're like, whoa, didn't ask for that. And so the public wants bears around. They don't want them in their backyards. So it's one of those, it's a delicate balance that agencies have to deal with. But a very good question. I don't think there's going to be active releases, but bear ranges absolutely are expanding. Okay, last question, I think. Kelly says, I wish California still had grizzlies. I'm willing to coexist with them, love them, beautiful, majestic animals. I wish everyone could take this webinar. Me too. Oh, okay, I will respond. Janice and Kira, earlier someone asked if all bears have delayed implantation. Yes, that is, that's just the function, that their species has that delayed implantation. It's a survival adaptation because they're going to be hibernating. Now, I will tell you, it's not just bears. You have some of these smaller animals, I think like mink and otter also have delayed implantation, but a lot of these overwintering mammals will exhibit it. Bears are one of the most well known as far as delayed implantation, but yes, all bears will have that. Okay, bears are beautiful. Let's move on and wrap this up and start taking a really in-depth look at what's going on with the bears. And I will apologize on the front end because I was researching, because brown bears are not my normal forte. I do a lot of research for these webinars, and I was really hoping to find a lot of different cool stuff that brown bears do, but they do a lot of the same things as black bears. There's some slight differences, and we'll go over that. But if you've been to the black bear super sleeper webinar, you're going to see some of these things because brown bears do the exact same thing. So let me go up so I can switch my slide. Okay, so why are bears sleeping through the winter? Why do bears hibernate? And just so you know, this is a huge pet peeve of mine, especially in the black bear world, because more and more people, and I don't know, I know where they're getting it, but more and more people say, oh, black bears don't hibernate. Yes, they do. They're the classic hibernators. Where many people are getting confused is they're not true hibernators, and I'm going to explain that, but they'll hear that term. They're not true hibernators. Oh, they don't hibernate. Yes, they do. Their bodies slow down. They shut down. That is what we're talking about. A period of time when your body literally stops functioning. Why are we doing this? Why are bears doing this throughout the wintertime? So why are they going to sleep in the wintertime? You have to understand, it's not because of snow. A lot of people think, oh, it's snowing out, they got to hibernate. It has nothing to do with snow, although that coincides with their hibernation. But what hibernation literally is, it's this evolutionary adaptation for an animal to survive when there's not a lot of food around. And so you have to understand, bears, especially those interior grizzlies, even the coastal bears, those salmon runs end sometime in the mid-fall. So there's not a lot of food swimming up those rivers anymore. All the vegetation, whether or not it's berries, nuts, it's gone. It's no longer growing. Those plants are no longer growing. Those plants are shutting down for the wintertime. And so those food sources that all these bears are feeding on, they disappear. They dry up. And so this hibernation is literally this adaptation because literally there's going to be no food available for these bears for months on end. And in order to survive, you got to be able to eat. And so one way that they can survive is, hey, let's shut our bodies down while there's no food out there for us to eat. And so that's why they do this hibernation. So when do they sleep? Very, very similar graphics, obviously, for this black bear presentation. But like I was telling you earlier, these brown bears, whether or not it's these interior grizzlies or these coastal brown bears, you saw their range in North America. You had these mountainous chains, the Rocky Mountains extending from that Wyoming, Montana, all the way up through Alaska. Most of Canada, all of Alaska. What do you think of when you think of those areas? It's cold, lots of snow. So you have to understand this wintertime is usually much, much more severe for brown bears than it is for black bears. And so their hibernation tends to be a little bit longer. They'll go into den a little bit earlier. Sometimes some of those bears may even be going to bed going to den late October. Usually most of them by November are all in there because those snows are coming and they're coming fast to where these brown bears live. Having said that, that snowpack is going to last much longer than it would typically in some of those more southern climates. And so instead of popping out of the den in March, might be April, might be as late as May in some of those higher elevation, higher latitude type of locations. And so again, it varies very much like the black bear, but for the most part, their hibernation is a little bit longer than black bears. So where do they sleep? And I had to change my slides for this because it's a little bit different. So we're going to look at den selection for a brown bear. I will tell you, and this was so interesting, and I learned this over the last couple of days, when it comes to black bears, I've got a ton of pictures. I got some photographers, friends of mine that has tons of black bear pictures. I myself have lots of pictures in bear dens and things like that. And then when I was putting this presentation together, it was like, dang, there's not a lot of grizzly or brown bear pictures for this. And I could explain what's going on. And part of it has to do with den selection. So very, very much like a black bear, these brown bears have these preferences for where they want to spend the entire winter. And so once again, they're looking for this tight, confined area. They've got to survive some extremely bitter cold. So the tighter it is, the easier it is to conserve heat. If they're laying in the wide open somewhere, their body's going to be dissipating heat, as opposed to if they're curled up in some tight little space, they don't lose as much heat. Once again, they need it dry. You're not going to find a bear den in some swampy area because it's going to tend to get flooded, especially with winter thaw. So obviously they need a place that's going to be dry throughout the entire winter and early spring. Now here's where it's a little bit different with these grizzlies, and this was through some of the research. They tend to den on steep slopes. And so I forget the actual angle is 30% or 60% slope. I can look that up. But literally the bottom line is they like these really steep slopes. Obviously they're hard to get to. And so if there's any concern, I don't know why a grizzly would have any concern, but these steep slopes are hard for other animals, particular humans, to get to on these steep slopes. And this is what was new to me. I never knew this until I researched it, but females in particular, if they are living in a mountain range, even those coastal bears, they don't den along the coast, they usually go up into the mountains. They tend to select den sites that are usually on the upper third of the mountain. And so what do we mean by that? You're talking higher elevation. It's going to be much colder. That snow is going to last a lot longer. Why they do that? Don't really know, but females tend to den a little bit higher than the males, which I thought was astonishing. So literally when you're looking at it, this is their landscape. This is where they're spending their winter time. Now imagine here, I was a bear researcher, still am a bear researcher, and when a black bear hibernates, you could go to his den pretty easy, especially when I was working in the southeast. It might be a long hike, but you're not hiking through 8 feet of snow. And so this is one of the reasons why there's not a ton of pictures, not a ton of data about these grizzly bear dens, because how do you possibly get to some of these den sites when they're a third of the way up that hill? Many of you know a lot of these places are prone to avalanche, and so it's pretty crazy where these brown bears end up denning. They're very well protected, but this is what they like. They like these inaccessible mountain ranges to select their wintertime den site. I thought that was fascinating. So how do they sleep? I just saw Bet said maybe she needs a longer time to den with her newborn cubs. That's a great theory, Bet. I'd love to know the answer to that, but that definitely makes sense, as she's going to be in that den much longer than the male typically is. So the dilemma about this bear, remember they're going to sleep for 4 months, possibly even 6 months. So this dilemma is, how do you stay alive without food or water for literally months on end? And again, this is usually a little bit longer than what black bears have to deal with. And so I changed this graphic because when we do the black bear hibernation, we use a sports car, but I figure grizzlies are more, I should have put a Mack truck in there, but grizzlies are usually, brown bears are usually built more like a truck. So we have a truck there because this is going to create that analogy to get you to understand. You're trying to keep this truck running and keep it running as long as you possibly can. So you fill up the gas tank as full as it could go. Now think of this as a bear. Their gas tank obviously doesn't take diesel fuel. Their gas tank takes fat stores. But in this case of the truck, you have a full tank of gas. So you have to think, how do we keep this truck running as long as we possibly can? So what is going to use more gas? If we fill up this gas tank and we run that truck at 70 miles an hour, 30 miles an hour, or we just keep it idling? Obviously, it's a really easy answer. You keep it idling. You just keep it running in the lowest setting it could possibly go. And so now convert that to a bear. We're looking at a bear. What this bear has to do is his body or her body has to begin idling. It's got to shut down all those exterior functions. We're not stepping on the gas. We're not playing the radio. We don't have the air conditioning on. We got to shut all those functions down. We just want that motor running so it stays, that motor going so it stays running. So obviously that motor running is what we'll call metabolism. That's what keeps the body alive, keeps the body working, or keeps the body running. Now, when it comes to a hibernator, a true hibernator, and this is where many people get mistaken about bears not being hibernators. Bears have distinct differences between a true hibernator, like a groundhog. If you look at a groundhog, it goes into its winter den, and the body shuts down. Their body's hibernating. It shuts down. Heart rate drops just a few beats per minute. Their respiration drops to they're almost no longer breathing. And this is the big thing. Their body temperature plummets. This is a true hibernator. This is that groundhog. So typically its body temperature may be in the 90s, high 90s. When it's hibernating, its body temperature drops to just above freezing. It could be 35 degrees, 36 degrees Fahrenheit. It's literally in a frozen coma. And so understand that every 20 degrees that body temperature drops, it's burning about 50% of the amount of energy it needs to stay alive. And so when you're dropping 60 degrees, think 50%, then another 20 degrees is another 25%, then another 20 degrees is another 12.5%. So you have a 87% drop in the amount of energy it takes to keep that animal alive. But it's frozen. Like I said, it's literally in a frozen coma. That is what a true hibernator is doing when it's hibernating in the wintertime. That's a groundhog, ground squirrels, Punxsutawney Phil. That's the biological function of a true hibernator. But this is why bears rock. Bears are what we call super hibernators. So they're still hibernators, but they do things a little bit different. Some things are the same. So if you look at the heart rate, their heart rate drops only a couple of beats per minute. Their respiration drops. They might only take a couple of breaths per minute when they're sleeping in their den. But this is what's phenomenal. This is what is that medical mystery. Their body temperature does not drop 60 degrees like those true hibernators. Their body temperature stays relatively warm. It might drop about 10 degrees. So they're maybe, this is where it's a little different because black bears, they're usually in the low 90s. These brown bears, these grizzly bears will be in the upper 80s, but it's still only about a 10-degree difference. And so they're warm. An 88-degree bear is still pretty warm. You could touch a hibernating groundhog and it's going to feel cold. You touch a hibernating bear and it feels like he's just sleeping because that's literally what he is. And so even though their body temperature only drops 10 degrees, their metabolism drops 75%. So they're literally burning only a quarter of the energy they need when they're wide awake. And that's phenomenal. That's that medical mystery. So they're literally in this den sleeping. They're warm and they're sleeping. They can wake up really, really easily. This is why bears are called super hibernators. So why is this so amazing? Okay, imagine emerging from the den that following spring. They've been in there for 4 months, possibly 5 months, even 6 months. They lost 30% of their body weight. What is absolutely miraculous is it's almost all fat. They barely burn, they might burn a little bit of muscle, but they burn almost all fat. In fact, what they determine is they can reconvert some of the nitrogen that builds up in their body and they reconvert that into muscle. Crazy. I don't understand that process. But literally when they lose all this weight, it's the fat stores that they're losing. So imagine looking like me right there. You go, you lay down and you decide you're going to sleep for 3 months and you wake up looking like that, where your muscle is still there, still very toned, in shape, but all your fat is gone. Wouldn't that be phenomenal? That is if someone could harness the ability to do that in humans, all these midnight weight loss programs will disappear because we know how to do it. We'd have to figure out how to do it from a bear. Another crazy thing is, once again, these bears, they're not getting out. They're not, especially the brown bear. Black bears tend to wake up and kind of move around and explore their surroundings every once in a while, especially during a warm spell. These grizzly bears and these brown bears, they don't get that warm spell. Oftentimes their den is buried under feet of snow. And so they're not urinating, they're not defecating within their den. And so can you imagine what they'd be like for humans? And so what bears do is they form this fecal plug. It's usually a hard mass, consists of lots of different things, proteins, hair, and it literally, best way to say it, they're putting a cork in it. And so they can't defecate. They're not going to urinate. And so what's amazing is typically if you're a human and you don't urinate or defecate, your body poisons itself. The kidneys produce these toxins, and if you don't get rid of those toxins, your body starts poisoning itself. This is why folks with issues with their kidneys have to go on dialysis to remove those toxins. Bears create these toxins and then they recycle them. How they do this, we have no idea. But this is what's so amazing about the bears. And last but not least, all that talk we had about delayed implantation and the females getting fertilized, those eggs implanted usually around late November, possibly early December, they're only grown a couple of months. And so she's going to give birth in the middle of her hibernation. With grizzlies, it tends to be usually around the month of February. And so they're only growing for a couple of months. A typical human gestation period is 9 months. And here you have these 800-pound female bears that are only, their gestation period's about 2 or 3 months. That's why those things are that big when they're born. So imagine how nice would that be if females could go to sleep, wake up, and their baby's next to them. Again, medical mysteries that are still unexplained. And this is why bears, obviously, they're one of my favorite animals, but there's truly so much to learn from them and so much we still need to learn because we have no idea how they do a lot of these things that they do. And then there were cubs. I'm going to save that for a whole nother presentation because I've already talked for over an hour, which is crazy. Um, but like I was telling you before, when it comes to black bears, I've got loads and loads of pictures. This was the only neonatal grizzly bear picture I could find. And I imagine this was probably taken from a zoo. But you could see when they're born, they're tiny. You have to understand these female brown bears could be anywhere from 500 pounds to the Alaskan ones could get up to be 800, 900 pounds, the females. And when you're giving birth to something that weighs only about a pound, pretty darn tiny. And so we could do it. I've done a Cubs Life presentation about black bear cubs. I just thought of a new webinar to do about a Cubs Life, but with grizzlies. So how do we know all this? Obviously, this isn't crawling into a grizzly bear den, but there are some amazing grizzly and brown bear scientists out there that have collected all this information, and they've gone to areas that you can only dream of for us to learn all this stuff and for me to be able to present it to you. And so they got the true life. I'd love to do that again. I did it a long time ago, but I don't know if my body could survive that again. So in summary, once again, Bob Howdeshell has got awesome pictures, but bears, especially brown bears, they're unlike any other animal. They truly are it's nature's super sleepers. The things that they do with their body and how they prepare for that hibernation all throughout the entire year is truly, truly amazing. And so with that, I got to thank Trish for sending me this cartoon because I cracked up the first time I saw it. If you can't read it, the top one says, "Bears are awesome," spelled out on the Ouija board. On the bottom one, the rabbit says, "Dude, stop moving it," which made me crack up. So anyway, photo credits, massive oodles of compliments to Bob Howdeshell. Carl Malcolm gave me a couple of these. Stole some from Fish and Wildlife Service website. Got to do this last spiel before I get to the questions, but almost everyone knows about the Wildlife for You website. If you don't, go there. That's where you can sign up online, or you could just follow us on Facebook or send me your email address and I'll send you updates on all the new classes. But we do have a Wildlife for You website. Once again, the easiest thing to do is follow us on Facebook. That Wildlife for You, I'm always posting what classes are coming up, but every once in a while we have an article or just a discussion point that we want to get input. So if you are on Facebook and you see that Wildlife for You, send in a question. Do something. Get involved. We'll keep that thing as active as you guys make it. But that's one of our easiest sources of communication. And last but not least, the plug for the next couple of webinars. So mark your calendars. Many of you are already signed up, but if you are not, in a couple weeks, 2 weeks from today it looks like it's a Wednesday. So 13 days from today is Timberwolves. It's Icons of America, Wild America. I've done this before. Some of you have done this before. There's going to be some new things in this one that we didn't talk about on the very first one. But that is a Wednesday webinar. A little bit different. I had some things going on, so that's on Wednesday. And then a new one, which I'm excited about. We're diving into the world of birds. And obviously I like predators for some reason, but owls have always captivated me. I had a story when I was a really little boy, and so a couple of people asked about doing some bird presentations on either raptors, and then the owls dawned on me. So we are going to tackle the world of owls with this webinar titled Whisper in the Woods. And it's going to be about owls in North America. So different cool things about the different species of owls we find in North America. So with that, you've seen this before. These are all the different webinars we have offered in the past, and we're coming up with new ones all the time. But Wildlife for You, tell all your friends and family about it. We love teaching you. And with that, I'm going to leave it on this slide because I think it's an awesome picture. And I will answer questions for as long as you keep asking them. Oh, I apologize. I forgot. Some of you guys it's after 10 o'clock back on the East Coast. All right. I scrolled back. I know a lot of you have to cut out. That's totally fine. Bet asks, what is the rate of cub survival for brown bears? It's often difficult to put a hard number on it. And I'll relate to black bears. I know a lot depends on the geographic area or what's going on in that particular area. And I will tell you some of the things that literally impact cub survival is obviously the food sources that are out there. So it can vary from year to year. Typically, a good number to think about, it's not a good thing to think about, but 50% cub survival is actually pretty good. There are so many different things that can go wrong. Obviously, food shortages. If they don't have enough food, remember, mom's first instinct is not her cubs. Her first instinct is what we call self-preservation. She's going to feed herself. And unfortunately, a lot of times, just with any kind of bear, it doesn't matter if it's black bear or brown bear, if there's a cub that cannot keep up, she can't put herself in jeopardy to try to feed it. And oftentimes those weaker cubs don't survive very long. And I don't like talking about this, but it's just the reality of things. But another big thing that is interesting is bear density. Grizzlies are an apex predator, meaning one of the things that apex predators, there's not a lot of them. And so you're not going to have like 5 grizzlies per square mile. You might have 1 grizzly for every 20 square miles. And so the density is usually really low. That is a characteristic of these apex predators, same with mountain lions. And so when you get incredibly high densities, and this is where it's getting crazy, because you think of those Yellowstone grizzlies, they're actually getting pretty thick in there. They're at densities that are really, really high. They can't expand too many areas, and so their population can't keep growing and growing and growing because their density is getting really at the high end of what it should be. Now understand, when there's a lot of bears around, that female gives birth to these cubs, which she's caring for throughout the entire year and a half. And if there's a lot of other male bears around, cubs tend not to survive as long. And so this is that crazy thing where we all know it's not good to have too few animals. It's also not good to have too many animals, because Mother Nature takes care of itself. If there's too many bears on the landscape, it's not going to keep growing. The reproduction rate will decrease, and it's generally because the cubs aren't surviving because the bear densities are so high. Anyway, all things being equal, if a female gets about 50% of her cubs to maturity or to adulthood, she's a really good mom. Sorry about the Wednesday, Kelly. I forget why I scheduled it, but I think I had something going on that Thursday where I wanted to do it. All right. I know it's getting late for most people. You guys were awesome. In case I haven't said that, thank you so much. Really good questions. Lori asked a really good question. Are there rescue rehab facilities for brown bears? They are few and far between, not many at all. Even black bear rehab facilities are few and far between. But grizzlies, there might be, I think there's one in Canada. I forget where it's at. I think it's in Alberta somewhere. But that is such a tricky topic. You look at the lengths that ABR goes through to make sure those bears don't become habituated. You got to be extra careful with grizzlies. Grizzlies are such a more dominant bear species that you got to make sure they do not become habituated or being fed by humans. Now, having said that, the good thing with most brown bears, they tend to live far, 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 far away from people. And so if it does happen, there's a chance that bear could live its whole life without seeing or encountering any other humans. But as far as there being lots of them, absolutely not. I don't know of any in the lower 48. I do know Canada has at least one, maybe two places, and I would imagine that Alaska might have something, but it's few and far between when it comes to grizzly bear rehabilitation. Uh, Don asked a question: is the bear in the picture a black bear? It looks like the claws are a bit black, but I can't tell. It's mostly from the angle. If I see what you're saying there, I think that might have a more. It might be more of a function of where that bear is digging. It's obviously really shallow water, so it's very muddy. So I think those front claws are a bit discolored. If you look at its rear paw, the claws, you can see how light colored they are. Now, having said that, it's not 100% true. That is absolutely, without a doubt, an Alaskan brown bear. And so you could. One of the other things is the shape of the face. It's more of dish face, and it's got a. If you look at the side profile, it definitely has an angle to it. But the other thing you see on this particular picture is that hump. Those brown bears, those grizzlies, have that indicative hump on their shoulder. But that's a good point. But I think a lot of it has to do with the mud that it's digging in right now. Okay, Don asked a question: is it more common to see a black bear or a brown bear in California? I don't know if Kelly is still on here, but Kelly, if you are, you could answer that pretty easy. Um, Unfortunately, uh, California does not have brown bears as far as the species brown bears. Now, they do have brown colored black bears, but it's sad because I believe the state flag of California is a grizzly. Um, but unfortunately, the state of California no longer has that species of brown bears within the state. So any bear that you encounter within the state of California is going to be a black bear. But because of all those different color phases, sometimes you have those brown colored black bears in there. I beat you to it, Kelly, but you are spot on, as I expected. Average lifespan of male versus female. Good question. And one of the things when it comes to wild animals, it's not true for every single species, but generally speaking, wild animals, females tend to live longer than males. One of the things that occurs is during that breeding season, you know what happens between males. They fight for the right to breed. Fighting is extremely dangerous. And so it doesn't matter if it's a deer or a bear, when you get the males between species fighting, things go wrong and some of those animals die. And because of that hard life, that fighting lifestyle, males tend to live shorter. Now, when it comes to brown bears, they're relatively long-lived animals. And so provided everything goes right, they don't get hit by a car, they don't have too many runs-in with humans, and their life is fairly normal. You'll have female grizzlies that'll be in the teens. A lot of those male bears might be in the lower. A really old male bear might be between 10 to 15 years old. Some of those females could possibly live between 15 to possibly even 20, but that'd be really old. But for the most part, brown bears are a fairly long-lived bear. And so the good thing is when you are the king of the forest, you don't have many things killing you other than humans. And so the only threat they typically have is when they're really tiny, when they're a young cub. If they could survive that and grow to be an adult brown bear, they don't have many natural enemies except themselves. And so when two male bears fight, or a male bear fights with another bear of its species, that's their biggest risk, so to speak. Okay, Dawn asks a really good question. I've heard that for black bears, you need to make a lot of noise, make yourself look bigger to scare it away. But for the brown bear, you need to curl up in a ball on the ground and cover your neck. Is that true? Um, yes and no. You don't. If a brown bear is coming at you, um, your best bet is to try to scare it away. Um, Obviously, you try to avoid it at all costs. You never want to have that close encounter. But if the bear's coming at you, you could yell, scream. That's where you use your pepper spray, your bear spray. You try not to have that encounter. Having said that, if there is contact with a black bear, in many situations, you fight back. With a brown bear, you never fight back because you are going to lose no matter what. And so your only hope, or your best hope, not only hope, but your best hope is to curl up and hope the bear just wants to eliminate the threat. Might bite you, might scratch you. Your best hope is that it makes that initial attack and then moves on. And so that is why you don't fight back, because if you fight back, you'll instigate it to keep on fighting. And they're such a large animal that you really don't stand much of a chance. And so that's why you got to curl up and hope for the best when it comes to that. The good thing is it doesn't happen all that often, but your best bet is not to get yourself in that situation, to avoid those close encounters, and always, always, always carry that bear spray. All right, any last questions? You guys have been wonderful. We've been on here some of you an hour and a half. Okay, Don asks, where can I find bear spray? Good question. Don't go to Walmart. It's not that I have that much against Walmart, except I do, but bear spray is not the typical pepper spray that you might find at Walmart. Bear spray is specifically designed for use on bears. And so they sell it in hiking stores, whether or not it's like REI or possibly a Bass Pro or some of those, even the mom and pop hiking stores will carry bear spray. There's a couple of different brands. One is Counter Assault, but make sure the outside of the can says bear spray. Now, understand it is a much larger can. It's usually about yay big. The reason it is bear spray is because they pack a lot more propellant in there, because they want it to reach out far. You don't want to wait till the bear is a few feet away. You want to hit that bear when it's 10, 20 feet away. And so those cans of bear spray have a lot more propellant to get that pepper spray out to them at a greater distance. But make sure you buy it at a hiking store like REI or something like that, and it will absolutely be labeled bear spray on the outside. Like I said, a good brand would be Counter Assault, but there's a few others you could buy as well. Well, Lori, if I didn't like these as much as you guys like listening to them, I'd be sick of them by now. But I absolutely love doing this. So I got to thank you guys for sticking in here and wanting to hear this stuff. Don asked if there's any other things to scare off a bear. I was talking earlier about those air horns. More and more people are using it, but I would never ever tell you to have that as your only line of defense, because there's no negative stimulus. And so that literally what we tell everyone is, if you are in an area that you're concerned where you might have a close encounter with a bear, make sure you have that bear spray available. But you can try other things. Like I said, the air horn, different things will scare a bear. And that's what you want to do, is make sure that bear does not become comfortable coming around people. All right, last minute questions, I believe. All right, now, well, once again, I want to thank you. I am going to stop the recording, and with that, I'm going to tell you, you guys were truly awesome, and I hope to see you at a future webinar, the Wolves, the Owls,